There's no mistake that The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is inspired by the original NES game, but as more information released, I realized the classic game isn't the only influence. Before its release, I wrote an article how Skyward Sword could affect the future of the Zelda franchise based on changing some of the series' traditions. Now with Breath of the Wild, I see elements and ideas they had with Skyward Sword fleshed out and more in tune with their original vision. One of the most obvious differences to fans in Skyward Sword was the addition of climbing. Chest-high walls were no longer your enemy. This ability was also coupled with the stamina gauge to regulate how long Link could exert himself climbing or performing other actions.
In Skyward Sword, the stamina gauge didn't serve a useful purpose. Climbing was limited to ledges, walls, and vines, but ledges and walls hardly used up stamina. Vine-covered walls got so tall they attached stamina fruit just so you wouldn't fall halfway through and could progress the story. It also stopped you from spamming spin attacks and running endlessly, not that it would matter. If you removed the stamina gauge, it wouldn't change how you play the game at all. Instead of adding stamina fruit, they could have nothing and let you fall. You would realize this mechanic has limits and be forced to think of a different solution. Breath of the Wild not only gives the stamina gauge purpose, but also expands on climbing. Instead of limiting where you're allowed to climb, you can climb on everything. This is why I liken Breath of the Wild's world to that of a jungle gym. You can climb, jump, and play in this area in however way you want and without being blocked by the story.
Now here's where the stamina gauge serves a purpose. By limiting how far Link can climb, it forces you to come up with creative solutions to navigate the world.
Like crossing a body of water by making ice pillars, because if Link tried to swim, he would run out of stamina and drown. Or by finding a nearby tower to use as a vantage point to fly from. If you knew you could scale the side of any mountain without falling, you wouldn't have a need to explore for solutions. You'd already have the solution. This would result in a linear experience like previous games, which they're obviously trying to avoid. Exploration is all about experimentation. Where climbing everything started was wanting to expand on the stamina gauge from Skyward Sword. We really enjoyed how that feels and how that works out, but we thought about how can we expand on that idea. In Skyward Sword, you're only able to climb in certain designated areas, and we kind of threw out all those limitations and made it so you can climb anywhere.
The Zelda games have big worlds to explore, but their 3D outings have been notorious for having wide spaces with little to do in them. This has been addressed by both games, but Breath of the Wild aims to take it further than its predecessor.
After Twilight Princess, Enuma felt its world was too big and wasn't fully utilized. He aimed to rectify this with Skyward Sword in two ways, by having smaller, dense areas and focusing on height and depth. It worked, but not without its drawbacks. Space was no longer wasted with long stretches of land without something to interact with, and there was plenty of elevation to add variety to the world. However, because Skyward Sword broke Hyrule into 3 isolated provinces, it felt more like selecting levels than exploring a cohesive world. The smaller environments also made it more obvious that it's a linear experience.
With Breath of the Wild, Enuma changed his stance on the Overworld Size. He recounted fans describing their desire to ride on horseback through an open field and to explore inaccessible areas in the distance. He agreed and would use this to influence the game.
This has resulted in an expansive version of Hyrule and takes height and depth to a greater extent by including mountains and towers. But to avoid repeating Twilight Princess's mistakes, there are more things to do in this world. Of course, there are the usual towns to visit, side quests to complete, and enemies to defeat, but instead of just a random group of enemies, you now have enemy camps to make combat more interesting and reward you with items. You can find mini-bosses to fight, sometimes hidden, including guardians, you can climb everything, you can find and tame horses in the wild with different stats, you can chop firewood or pick apples off of trees, you can hunt animals for food or items and use those to cook better food. With Skyward Sword, crafting wasn't really necessary, but here enemies will kick your ass. Because enemies are tough, it makes crafting integral to the adventure and to your success. The biggest addition by far are the shrines. There are dozens of these mini-dungeons spread across Hyrule and they're brand new to the franchise. This is one of many activities to make the world worth exploring again. It gives you something meaningful to do in between story sections and was included for that very reason. Shrines can also reward you with items you would usually find in a dungeon, now called runes, as they won't be in dungeons anymore. There are so many questions to ask before entering a shrine. Will it use a single ruin or multiple ruins? Is it a small stage or a large stage? Is there a mini-boss or not? Is it a puzzle shrine or a combat shrine or something else entirely? And so on.
I think this is what Aonuma was referring to when he was talking about breaking the convention of playing by yourself. Players will have their own unique experiences with the world and shrines, and this in turn will encourage them to share with others and learn new information in the process.
Challenging something in a way that I think this is going to work, and then discovering, oh, this isn't going to work, it's not actually that much of a painful experience. It's actually fun. It's a sense of discovery, and as we were developing this, I thought to myself, maybe this is what it means to create a big world, to find out that getting lost is okay.
There are 4 key components to make up a Zelda game: dungeons, items, an overworld, and puzzles. By far, puzzles are the most influential component. Without them, items would just be weapons and dungeons would just be fighting arenas. But it hasn't really affected the overworld until Skyward Sword. This was where Aonuma wanted to shake up the series.
His mission for Skyward Sword was to change the formula of finding a dungeon, returning to the field, and repeating. It was at this point where he got the idea of making dungeon-like areas before the dungeons themselves. Segments like helping the Kikwi in Faron Woods and manipulating timeshift stones in the Lanayru mine are what resulted. The environment wasn't the only thing influenced by puzzles though, but enemies on the field as well. Each enemy from Deku Babas to various bokoblins had their own specific way of being defeated. This, coupled with the new environment segments, led Skyward Sword to become a more puzzle-focused Zelda game, and why it was claimed that the entire game is a dungeon. While Skyward Sword aimed to change the series, it was still within the framework of past games. Aonuma would later admit that Skyward Sword wasn't able to fully break from its traditional past.
For Breath of the Wild, they decided to take a different approach. First, they scrapped the previous battle system. It really only worked for motion controls anyway. Instead, the problem solving comes in the form of strategy.
Will you sneak up to an enemy for a stealth kill, light an explosive barrel, use magnesis to bludgeon a mini-guardian, or go full-out blitzkrieg?
Enemies can deal a ton of damage, and they won't wait for your turn either, so you'll have to devise different strategies. There's much more freedom to be had in combat, and some of that is owed to having a physics engine.
As far as the overworld is concerned, the journey to get to your destination is a challenge in and of itself. It's reminiscent of Skyward Sword's pre-dungeon segments, the idea to have puzzle solving on your way to a dungeon. In Breath of the Wild, the story won't block your access to an area. You can access anything if you can find a creative solution. If you wanted to enter a cold region, you could wear thicker clothing, or you could cook a ton of spicy food to keep you warm. With a body of cold water, you could find a way around it, or you could look for a raft to cross the river. Perhaps you use the Cryonis rune instead to create a path. The wealth of options you have to solve any challenge in this world will give you more reasons to explore than simply a gap between destinations. We quickly realized that a lot of the fun was actually in getting to the dungeon, and so we focused on getting to the dungeon in this game. We wanted to create an environment where it is fun to find the dungeon in this large world.
As much as fans were mixed about Skyward Sword, it played an important part in Zelda history. It reignited a creative passion that was once gone. It birthed new ideas to become core fleshed out features. It started the process to go back to the drawing board than to follow a pre-made template. If Skyward Sword was a traditional Zelda game, I don't think Breath of the Wild would be as revolutionary as it is. The fatigue from following traditions with Twilight Princess and the struggle to try something new with Skyward Sword has led us to this point today. Skyward Sword may not have been a perfect game, but it was a necessary stepping stone to give us Breath of the Wild.
When I say I'm tired, I'm not talking about making Zelda, but rather the same constituent that has been used to make Zelda up until now. Why does it have to be traditional? That's the question I've been asking myself. Something that is traditional, in a sense, often something that copies previous works, so if you continue doing that, it gradually takes away from its uniqueness. So we're currently working on making those parts more and more unique.
And for the record, I'm not biased for Skyward Sword. It was okay, I'd probably give it a 7 or 7.5 out of 10.
Thanks for watching. Speaking of Zelda, check out Rasputin's video here. He perfectly sums up what makes Breath of the Wild's world fresh and why it stands out in a sea of open world games.